This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below.
The further away you get from the season, the more narratives start to paint reality more than the truth itself, because the truth gets fuzzy. You don't remember every down of that game. You don't remember whose fault that first down was. You remember what people have been saying about that game. You remember what people have been arguing about that game, because unfortunately, narratives tend to have a longer shelf life than the truth, which is concerning, but that's a whole video for a whole nother day. This has been the case, undoubtedly to me, with the whole Browns road defense narrative. And this narrative was one that the Browns were this generational defense at home, but if you take them out of the confines of Cleveland Browns Stadium, they suddenly morphed into a below average defense on the road. And this narrative, to me, is one that is misleading and over exaggerated to the point of being outright false. It's not outright false, but it is over exaggerated. It is gassed and it is misleading. And in this video, I'm going to spell out why that narrative. And in this video, I'm going to tell you why I feel that way about this narrative. Now, before we even start to talk about why I think this narrative is gas, we have to talk about why this narrative has been so easy to gas up. And that is simple. Because when you look at the narratives, the stats provided that usually support this narrative, it's compelling. The Browns defensive splits in 2023 on the road were below league average across the board in almost every rushing number. And then they were lower than average with QB rating, something that they excelled with strongly at home. The Browns also gave up 13.88 points or 125 points at home. And then on the road, they gave up 282, which averages out to 31.3 points a game. It's a big difference. It's a 20-point difference almost between road and home. And that's going to be very convincing for a lot of people because that's all the evidence some people need to see. But when you dig deeper for the context that surrounds those numbers, that's when the narrative really starts to fall apart. For example, let's talk about the Browns giving up 31.3 points on the road on average, or 282 points all year on the road. And it seems like enough to kind of paint that narrative is true. But when we look at how those points got there, it starts to look a little different because not all of the points allowed are really the defense's fault on the road. The Browns offense was volatile, one of the most volatile offenses in the NFL last year. They were the most turnover-prone offense in the NFL. And these turnovers contributed greatly to Browns' points allowed numbers, but that's something that's hard to make tangible. So what I wanted to do was make it tangible. To do this, I went through the game log of every Cleveland Browns game in 2023 and calculated the points allowed by the defense with these two rules to control for the offense's contributions to any points that were allowed. What I wanted to do was isolate all the points that you can reasonably attribute to the Browns offense failures or special teams failures by forgiving those points in situations where it makes sense. Basically, I wanted to see how many of the Browns' points allowed on defense had more to do with turnovers on offense and special teams, more so than the defense's actual performance with their starters in that game. You know, times where the defense was just put in a no-win situation by the offense or special teams. The two rules that helped me determine this were simple. If the Browns defense gave up a field goal or touchdown on a drive that was started on the Cleveland Browns 50-yard line or in Cleveland territory, 3 points are forgiven. For this rule, I have two examples. One, if the Browns throw an interception and the other team gets the ball on the 40-yard line of Cleveland territory, and then they kick a field goal, those 3 points are forgiven from the Browns' points allowed total. Or if that same scenario happens, the Browns throw an interception, the other team gets the ball on the Cleveland 40, and they score a touchdown, the 7 points of the touchdown are not completely forgiven in that scenario because the Browns defense had a reasonable chance to at least force a field goal if the ball was not turned over in their own red zone. But you do get 3 of those points forgiven from that touchdown because it was reasonable to assume that the Browns would give up a field goal in that situation, or at least 3 points in that situation. The second rule is if the Browns defense gives up a touchdown on a drive that started in the red zone, then the 6 points plus the extra point are forgiven. For example, the Browns fumble the ball in their own territory and they give up the ball on the 5, and then the other team punches it in at the 5. It is not reasonable to attribute those points to the Browns defense. Yes, they could have stopped them, but they were put in a no-win situation. Again, what I'm trying to do with these two rules is simply isolate the no-win situations so that those aren't points that are attributed. This is not getting rid of every point that's scored on a turnover. If the Browns turn the ball over, but it's not in their own territory and they give up a touchdown or a field goal, those points are not forgiven. So not all points off turnovers are forgiven. I'm not acting like it's reasonable to assume that the Browns would play in a world where they would never turn the ball over. But I am pointing out that the Browns were in situations where they did have a lot of very unfortunate turnovers, and those unfortunate turnovers happen way more on the road than they did at home, which kind of affected the points allowed number and made it seem like the team was so much different on the road than they were at home. Also, exceptions were made for situations where the Browns starting unit was completely benched, like week 16 in Houston, where 14 points were scored on a complete secondary unit, or in week 18, where the Browns did not put their starters out there or attempt to win that game in any good faith. So those two situations, the points that were scored on the Browns defense and count on their total points allowed number, those points are forgiven because that's not the unit that we're evaluating, right? We're not talking about if Siaki Ika is a good road defender. Don't nobody care about that. We're talking about the starting unit. So if we go through week by week on the road, the points forgiven goes like this. In week 2, there are 14 forgivable points for the Browns defense. There was a pick 6 and a fumble 6. Doesn't get more clear than that. In week 7, there's 3 forgivable points against the Colts, where PJ Walker fumbles a fourth and inches conversion on the 50-yard line, which leads to a field goal. In week 8, there are 3 forgivable points. In week 10, there are 14 forgivable points. A pick 6 that happens at the beginning of the game, and a muff punt within the 20 that resulted in a touchdown. James Prochet muffed the punt. Then the Ravens scored a touchdown shortly after that. Week 12, there are 9 forgivable points. There was a fumble that turned into a touchdown, and then a safety in week 12 against Denver. Week 13 against LA, there were 2 interceptions that turned into touchdowns, but weren't necessarily enough to forgive like the whole 14 points, but enough where 3 of those points got forgiven. And then Joe Flacco got a safety, which again, 8 points. If you get a safety, that's completely not the Browns defense fault, but that does count points allowed. So those points are forgiven. Week 16 against the Houston Texans, 7 points are forgiven, were basically the fault of a Joe Flacco interception. 15 points allowed when the Browns starters were benched in the game entirely. So that brings you up to 22 points for week 16 that are forgivable. And then obviously week 18, when no starters played, all 31 of those points are forgivable when it comes to the Browns points allowed totals. So we're just not going to count week 18 entirely. You add that up, you get 93 forgivable points from the Cleveland Browns defense. So 93 of those points that count towards the Browns rolled points allowed are points that you can reasonably attribute to the Browns offense or special teams and not necessarily the Browns defense. If you want to know what this is per game, it's an absurd number. It's 11.6 points a game that the Browns defense gives up because of something other than the Browns defense, which is like competitive to what they gave up on the road entirely per game. So they had to overcome the offense creating almost 12 points for the opposing team on every road game. Now, if you're wondering if this number was different at home, it was. The Browns had 54 forgivable points at home, which is about 6 points a game. Still not a good number. You don't want to be overcoming a touchdown every game because your team can't stop turning the ball over, but it's significantly less than the 11.6 points a game that the Browns offense and special teams were creating for the defense on the road. It's twice as much. It's a 100% increase. If you subtract those numbers from the road and home points allowed, you get a Browns defense that gave up less than 8 points per game at home, and you have a Browns defense on the road that gave up 19.75 points allowed on the road, which is good for about 10th in the NFL if you average it out for points allowed. So the Browns defense was certainly not as good on the road as they were at home, but they weren't a different defense. They were just not the best defense in the NFL. They were number 10, not number 1. Sometimes this narrative gets thrown around, and as narratives do, they get more exaggerated as each people try to one-up each other that tells that narrative. Sometimes you hear people talk like the Browns were like the number 1 defense in the universe at home, but like they were like the 30th defense on the road, and they were that awful. It's greatly exaggerated. The Browns went from a number 1 defense at home to a top 10 defense on the road. It's not that like big of a leap. Now, we do have to address, though, that the Browns gave up almost 11 more points on average per game on the road. Why did this happen, right? Why did they give up 11 more points? Regardless of if you're even giving up that many points to begin with, why is there an 11-point delta between what the Browns were doing at home versus what they were doing on the road? I do think that's something worth evaluating. And I think these have pretty obvious and simple answers once you really think about it. The number one reason I think that there was this delta between road and home points allowed outside of the offense and special teams contributions to those numbers was injury. In their first 5 games of the season, 4 of them were home games. They had a lot of home games early. We know the Browns got injured as the season went on. They only played 3 home games at the tail end of the season when the injury bug really hit Cleveland the hardest on the defensive side of the ball, which, side note, the defense avoided injury pretty much until week 10 of the season. And then the road trip happened and the Browns injury bug, especially on the defensive side, really started to get worse, right? Denzel Ward was in and out of the lineup for the end of the season. Myles Garrett was dealing with a shoulder injury that seemed to impact how he played at the end of the season. It's like the most forgotten about shoulder injury because he played through it. But people thought he was going to miss like a month when that first happened. He ended up missing, I don't think he even missed a game, but still, he was dealing with that shoulder injury at the end of the season. Obo Okoronkwo went out for the rest of the year. Grant Delpit went out. Ronnie McLeod went out for the rest of the year. Same thing with Juan Thornhill, who was in and out the lineup for the rest of the year. Greg Newsome was in and out the lineup for the rest of the year. Maurice Hurst got injured for the rest of the year. And when this team was playing the bulk of their road games, which was after week 10, they were just more injured. And I think that is why that number seems so much bigger than it should be. Because even if you throw out just the road and home splits, if you look at the Browns defense before week 10, they gave up 17.3 points a game. If you look at the Browns defense from week 10 and on, they gave up 26.8 points a game. they weren't just worse on the road. They were worse after week 10 because they were just significantly more injured after week 10 of this season. They just were a worse defense because they had worse players available because they were injured. I think that part got completely missed in this road home defense argument that people have been having. I think the second factor is that the quality of offenses that they played were simply just better on the road. Notable quarterbacks that the Browns played at home were Joe Burrow, Ryan Tannehill, Lamar Jackson, Brock Purdy, and Trevor Lawrence. But the Joe Burrow game that they got was a rain game where the passing offense wasn't going to be good for either side. Also, while Joe Burrow was dealing with a calf injury that significantly hampered his play for the first 3 weeks of the season, it was very noticeable. Ryan Tannehill was just not very good at that part of the season or at any part of this season, even by Ryan Tannehill standards. Brock Purdy was without C-Mac and without Deebo Samuel by the end of the game that he played against the Cleveland Browns. Trevor Lawrence was in the middle of the coldest streak of the year for him where he was just playing awful football. I think Lamar Jackson in week 4 was the one time you got a good shot at one of a quarterback's best shot at this Browns defense at home, right? I think that's the only time that really happened for this defense at home. On the road, it was the exact opposite. Yes, you played Geno Smith, but you played Geno Smith when the Seahawks were at their hottest point of the season. That was when the Seahawks were in first place. You got Lamar at his hottest point of the year. You got Matt Stafford during a massive win streak for the LA Rams. You got CJ Stroud and even somebody like Russell Wilson. You were playing him at his best stretch of the year when he was in the middle of a massive win streak for him as well. So you played Russ at his hottest point of the season. And you were also simultaneously during that stretch at your most injured defensively. These factors don't exist in a vacuum. They kind of compound on top of each other. I don't think the Browns' issues with playing on the road have much to do with playing on the road. I don't think this was like they don't sleep well on the road or they're not staying in their hotels issue. I think this is a case of correlation does not necessarily equal causation. Because when you look at some of the factors that determine this, there are more plausible factors that can explain why this happened than the Browns defense suddenly becoming bad because they played on the road. The Browns offense just threw more costly turnovers on the road than they did at home. They had 18 turnovers at home, 19 on the road. It seems like that should be similar, but despite that being the case, we have 94 forgivable points for the Browns offense, for the Browns defense on the road versus 54 at home. They were giving up more costly turnovers on the road, and those turnovers were more frequently being turned into points because of the field position that the Browns were giving up on those turnovers, right? Joe Flacco was a huge part of this. I mean, those numbers explode once Joe Flacco gets into the lineup, and Joe Flacco got into the lineup when the Browns were pretty much, had 2 or 3 home games left throughout the season, but I think they had 5 road games still left to play. But that's not the only factor. It's not just that the Browns were throwing more costly turnovers. It's also that the Browns were significantly more injured in the second half of the season when they played more road games than they were in the first half of the season when they played more home games. Another thing that compounded on that, quality of offense went up at the same time that the defense is starting to get injured more often. All of those things compounded to a defense that appears to be much worse on the road than they are at home. The good news, if you're somebody who's worried about this showing up again, is that it's very unlikely that the Browns defense's issues were exclusive to being on the road and had a lot more to do with all those other things. So I don't think the road defense split is one you really got to worry about this season, but those other things are things that you have to watch for. I'm not a big believer in the road home narrative for the Cleveland Browns defense. I don't think it's a road or home thing. So that's my answer to any question you have about the Browns road and home defense. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.